Hello and welcome to Paincast, Conversations on Pain and Physiotherapy. This podcast is brought to you by the Pain Science Division of the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. I'm Tiffany, a physiotherapy student at the University of Toronto. I have the honor to chat with Dr. Mike Landry. He is the past president of the Canadian Physiotherapy Association and the current president of World Physiotherapy. He is also a father of three, a professor and researcher, an entrepreneur, and has previously been heavily involved in global health and humanitarian efforts as a physiotherapist. What he has done in his career is truly impressive, and he is no less than a very accomplished individual. This episode is a little different from the usual Paincast episodes. In part one of our conversation, we chatted on topics from individual to societal changes we need to make. We chatted about why it is important to actively envision the future of physiotherapy and how changes can be made, but also tying that back to the individual physiotherapist level. In part two of our conversation, we chatted about physiotherapy from a global perspective. We talked about the work of World Physiotherapy and what does the profession of physiotherapy look like in different parts of the world. It was an intriguing and eye-opening chat that I had with him. Before we jump into this chat, as a reminder, Paincast brings together researchers, clinicians, students, and patients to facilitate discussions, knowledge translation, and critical thinking on topics about pain and physiotherapy. The views expressed in each episode are of individual guests, do not constitute medical advice, and do not represent the views of the Pain Science Division nor the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. Enjoy the chat.
So World Physio, let's go to there now.
Yeah, so for those in the audience that don't quite know about World Physiotherapy, introduce this association and its overarching goals for us.
Yeah, so World Physiotherapy, in 2 years, we will celebrate our 75th anniversary of existence. And most of the high-income countries who have associations, Canadian Physiotherapy Association, the Royal Dutch Association, the list goes on, are all members of a global federation. That global federation is called World Physiotherapy. It used to be called the World Confederation of Physical Therapy, but there was a rebranding 4 or 5 years ago. We are the global voice of physiotherapy. We currently have 127 member organizations, so these are associations around the world and growing. We represent about 600,000 to 700,000 physiotherapists globally, so a fairly large constituency, but we're a small organization that exists to support its members. And so, for instance, on World PT Day, we translate a whole number of information in multiple different languages. That's external facing. On the internal facing, we work with member organizations to achieve their goal. For instance, last year, around this time, actually, I was in Hanoi with the Vietnamese Physiotherapy Association, who were meeting with the Minister of Health, like the Minister of Health. And so that association could only meet if the president of the global body was there, which is where I came in. And they had some really wonderful advocacy and turned out to have wonderful outcomes and are moving towards direct access. So we support at that level. But we really are the global voice for physiotherapy. One of our plans for the 75th is to vision the future, sort of very related to the other points that I brought up. But it really is, where should we go into the future? Because if you put all the organizations on let's say just a linear line here, you would have large organizations like France with 75,000 members, all the way to other associations with 4 or 7. For instance, in Haiti, I think there are 17 members at the moment. It's a very difficult situation there. So our responsibility is to create value across that diaspora. So we have our next Congress, and this is a little, shameless plug, but the next Congress is going to be next May in Tokyo, in Japan. And part of what we do when we have congresses in countries is we create a legacy project. So we'll be working with the JPTA, the Japanese Physical Therapy Association, to establish a much stronger education system. Currently in Japan, there are many different levels of education to get to a PT, but there's a need to harmonize. And I wasn't on the board when they selected Japan, but I'm glad it's there because at the same time, we also have China, who has a phenomenal amount of PTs of different levels who are working very hard with us to gain membership. And so being in Asia gives us an opportunity to highlight not just for Japan, but for the region as well. We also, World Physio has 5 regions: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and what we call the Asia West Pacific. And the Asia West Pacific also includes countries like PNG, Papua New Guinea. And so some of the challenges that PNG is facing is very different than Japan. And so we really try to work within our network and our members to create high value for membership. During the pandemic, there was, I tend not to talk about the pandemic because it was so long ago. And people of my age actually made a lot of money during the pandemic because all of us had investments. So it was one of the greatest transfers of poor to wealthy towards the rich, or young to the old. So again, Tiffany, another conversation for a different podcast. But nonetheless, there was some challenges for the Global Association during the pandemic. And so we're still moving away from that legacy, let's call it. And I'm really looking forward to Japan, which will be fully in person, hybrid options too, but fully in person. It'll be fantastic. And we're going to, hopefully, given the population in Asia, but one of the highly attended congresses in our history.
Mm-hmm. I'll be there, Mike, hopefully.
Nice. Great. Well, let's do another podcast on site.
That would be fantastic. That's what I was planning to do. So you talked about the external facing side of World Physiotherapy, for example, working hard for World PT Day, for education, advocacy, etc., and the internal side of things, supporting member organization on their goals, what they want to achieve. To help our audience better understand the landscape of different member organization or different physiotherapy among the world, would you be able to explain a few types of organization, a few types of countries, and how physiotherapy works in those countries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe an example, one that would be relevant for this audience. The Canadian Physiotherapy Association has a CEO, a staff. These are not always physios, but they're a staff. And their job day to day is to implement the strategic plan of the board. Very sophisticated. And if you look at across the world, that's because CPA is over 100 years old. So it's developed and evolved over time. Other organizations are fully run by volunteers. So they're just well-meaning physiotherapists who, collect membership dues and pay it to World Physio and really seek an engagement at a much higher level. For many countries, in low-income countries in particular, being a member of a global association gives them street credibility. Like, it's just street cred. It just shows that they're part of something bigger than the grinding up, environment that they currently live in or currently have. Those are two extremes. In the middle, which is where most of our member organizations fall, and let's say most of them would be middle-income countries. Lebanon would be an example. Morocco, I think, is another, where they're right on the cusp of having staff, but not always a full staff complement. So they work hard to achieve, but it becomes really difficult because they're not high income and they're not low income. So they're not always eligible for grants or multilateral grants. So many different constituencies here. The other important difference, and this happens a lot in European and Francophone countries where it's very similar to Quebec, actually, but they have what's called the order. So the regulatory body is the association at the same time. So for instance, in Canada, I haven't looked at the stats recently, but I think we're below 50%. So less than 50% of physios in Canada are members of CPA. I might be wrong. Maybe it's higher. I can't remember. But if you look at the United States, it's like 35. If you look at other countries, it's rather low. But if you go to France, our member organization is the regulator. It's the Order of the French Physiotherapists. It's a different name. But so then you have, even within our grouping of 127 member organizations, different configurations, which creates a huge opportunity to learn more from each other. So I think if we were to look around and you go back 10, 20 years and you look to today, The growth has been phenomenal. What many have been able to achieve is incredible. Rarely do I go anywhere in the world now where people, governments, etc., they don't know what physiotherapy is. Like I think we've arrived. And in fact, I was at the World Health Assembly back in May, and usually day one, the World Health, it's a 5-day event. And usually day one is a lot of just presentations from different countries who may not be there. And the Minister of Health from Indonesia stood up there and mentioned physiotherapy by name as an important pillar towards their community-based healthcare delivery system. In front of the world, a Minister of Health mentions physio. 20 years ago, that would not have happened. So we are making significant progress. We're going in the right directions. I mean, that's incredible. That's where we are today. We're right on the cusp of continuing to build and to grow. And what I would personally like to see is that we represent over 1 million people in 3 years. So right now we're 600, somewhere in between 6 and 700,000 based on our membership. I want to be able to stand up, and all of us stand up around the world and say, World Physiotherapy represents over 1 million physiotherapists globally.
Mm.
And by the way, that growth is going to be from low and middle income countries. There's going to be some growth, maybe the penetration rate for like big organizations, but it's going to come from the smaller groups who need and want to be part of the constellation.
So was it accurate to say that the overarching goal of World Physiotherapy is to elevate the status of this profession across the world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if you look at some of our policy documents we released last year, the educational framework, we're looking at a regulatory framework now. We have a new program that'll start rather soon where we have educational credits. So if you were to create a course, you could have it accredited by World Physio. And then the people who attend and participate get the World Physio credit, which might not mean the world in Canada or elsewhere, but in some low and middle income countries, this is a game changer for them. So yes, so it's about creating value. It's about elevating the profession. It's about elevating the individual associations, helping them become the association that they want to be of the future. Because the real work happens at the association level, right? At the country level. We are there to support them.
Yeah. So talking about World Physiotherapy with member organizations of all sorts that we've talked about, how does it work as something like a global village to help each other out rather than big member organizations helping small ones or World Physiotherapy helping out small ones? How does that interaction and relationship work?
There's another brilliant question coming from you there, Tiffany. I'll start on the positive side and I'll say where we need to do more work. But on the positive side, so we have these 5 regions, and these regions are there to support the regional interests. Because, in all honesty, maybe there is commonality between a PT in Trinidad versus a PT in Indonesia, but there's a lot more relevance between Trinidad and some of the other Caribbean islands in the north than Canada and the United States. So we've created these regions, and hopefully we'll be moving to support them in a different way. But even beyond that, I think what's really, really key for the future is that we have leadership at all levels, at sort of a global level, at a national level, a regional level, and then sort of in a community level. When we have networks and ladders of leadership, I think we can scale our opportunities. And so that's part of what we hope and really are focusing in on building. We're very proud in 3 years from now, we will be hosting our first Congress in South America. In Mexico, it'll be in Guadalajara, which will be for the very first time inside of South America. Now, again, with technology, participation, because of geography or language, is no longer a barrier. It used to be, but there is no longer a barrier. We will be developing the network and the technology that's required so that anyone everywhere can participate in Congress and really start working in between each other. For instance, I've spent a fair amount of time with the Greek Association, the Pan-Hellenic Physiotherapy Association. They've done some amazing work. They've had some real challenges with clawbacks with the government. But for instance, they want to create a program because every year in the fall, they have what's called the historic marathon, where people run from a small village called Marathon into the ancient Olympic Stadium in Athens. And so we'll be creating opportunities for global physiotherapists to come to Greece to participate as a medical team in Greece for this amazing event, this amazing Olympic marathon. And so I think that's a low level, that's sort of a person to person. But at that point on, we start developing these relationships and we start developing the opportunities to explore. Because right now, that is something we need to do a lot more of. We need to create that interconnectedness, that interoperability between associations, so that if one association has a challenge in, I don't know, direct access or protection of title, there should be a repository of information or of other member organizations who have struggled with the same issue, so that there could be a compendium. MOs could go and look at that, find out who and how they overcame, and then reference them back there. I mean, we want to be that Cupid to introduce everybody. I mean, best day for me is when World Physiotherapy is sort of opening up channels between everybody around the world, and they're having the conversations, irrespective of location, irrespective of language.
You were going to talk about what we need to do more of. How do we do better in this?
Yeah, well, I think, we're so busy all day long in sort of our individual lives. I think it's a two-way street. On the one hand, World Physiotherapy has and will continue to demonstrate value. But I think, just as I said, the world of physiotherapy will be different in the future. Well, so too must a global association be different in the future. And so we need to be thinking, well, how do we reinvent, how do we re-engineer world physiotherapy such that it actually becomes a more effective, a more efficient, a more sort of globally responsive organization than it is today? And I think the way that happens is through strategy. I think, I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at a visioning of the future, which will include what is the role of world physiotherapy? What is the role of a global network anymore? I mean, things have been so localized since 2019, but we have to start opening it up. Maybe I'll give you a tangible example. So I mentioned Greece a little while ago, the Pan-Hellenic Association. So they, over the last few years, have been exposed to what's called a financial clawback. So it means during the entire year, physios can bill the government. And at the end of the year, over the last few years, the government has come back to the network of physiotherapists saying, we overpaid, you now have to pay us back, claw back. Now, this has been quite devastating, of course, because it happens at the end of the calendar year. Is it legal? Yes. Does it happen? Yes. Will it continue? Probably. Does it happen in other places other than Greece? And the answer is yes. So this is where Greece and the other countries who are being exposed to similar financial leverage at the federal level need to start talking. And we can be the interlocutor in those really important points, because World Physiotherapy and all of the member organizations are a point of engagement, right? A meeting point, a relationship. But it has to be much more than that. It has to do and perform and to lobby and advocate. So things like the clawback that are happening in Southern Europe just have to stop. And so we have a personal interest at World Physiotherapy to be involved. We're writing letters, visiting and meeting with the Ministry of Health alongside the European region, again, to lobby and to change the course, because this will be devastating. I mentioned salaries before in Venezuela. Well, in Southern Europe, the average salary is about €1,000 a month. That's a whole month's of work for €1,000. Compared to the United States or Canada, that's a difficult run.
Right. Now, do you think it has been facilitated, like the interconnectedness of different member organizations?
I think there's regional variation here. In Europe, if you drove from Thunder Bay, Ontario to Ottawa, and you took that distance and you put it in Europe, you would have passed like 7 countries, right? So countries are a little bit more compact. They also exist in the European Union, which has mobility. So they already engaging in discussions and conversations, et cetera, because of regional law, European law. So if we were to look at that interconnectedness, I think in Europe it's very strong, very strong. In Canada and the United States, I believe there's an amazing amount of collaborations. The same happens with, I believe, New Zealand and Australia. But it's because of the people involved. It's not always because of anything else. And so what we want to do is elevate that. So it becomes a little bit more than just, oh, well, who is currently the president? And I'm not saying that's the reason why it happens or doesn't, but we need to be able to create an environment where we have a lot more of sharing, a lot more conversation, a lot more of opportunity exploration, not just for the purposes of interacting, but with an outcome in mind, right? With an outcome in mind. And let's face it, some organizations are much more sophisticated than others. And so the value that maybe a large organization would get or obtain from a small organization would be different. But everybody has to have a win here for this relationship to work. And so I think in the past, a lot of these have been one way. I think we need to do a lot better job at that.
Bring it back a little more locally, Canadian Physiotherapy Association as a member organization in World Physiotherapy, what has been typically the role of CPA in this context?
Well, the CPA has been a strong supporter right from the beginning. In fact, CPA was a founding member of World Physiotherapy in 1951. And so the organization relies heavily on its founding members. And so I think all the way from simple things like feedback on policy documents, consultations, et cetera, CPA has always been there to support World Physiotherapy. And that would be true among pretty much all organizations around the world. I've never experienced a scenario where a country would say, well, no, we're just not interested in that. I think we have a really strong gestalt of collaboration. But Tiffany, we need to do better at World Physio. We need to do better at creating value for segmented parts of our communities. And so more discussions are going to happen over the next few years with large organizations around how can World Physiotherapy support them? What would they see as a valuable contribution from the global community to them? And some of that might be nuanced. Some of it might be complex. And in other scenarios, it might be very simple. So I think we just haven't had a good look at that. Now, there's an interesting point to be made is that if you try to make everybody happy, it's difficult to make anyone really happy, you know. So what we need to do is not look at all the 127 organizations as a homogenous group, but as individual unique units in a segmented part of our community. And how do you create those bits of value? Now, let me open up a bit of complexity here, that another one I don't tend to talk much about, but at the moment, if you look at Israel, Palestine, Gaza scenario, with the horrible outcomes that have been unfolding before the world's eyes, we, World Physio, are part of the World Health Profession Alliance. And so we've issued statements right from the beginning to support our overall collective cause of nonviolence to civilians and certainly not having health professionals under attack, direct target. Now, all the board, myself maybe in particular, have received a fair amount of feedback. Shall we say feedback? Yeah, feedback on that. And, you know, it's a very difficult point because on the one hand, we have to be able to support our members in both Palestine and Israel, right? And stay clear to the overall objective in terms of humanitarianism. So August 8th is World Humanitarian Day, which World Physio will be issuing another statement around support for the policies of nonviolence to civilians and to healthcare workers. The tragedies, though, continue. And so I think from a global level, we at World Physio must do better at interacting with the global community at that level around supporting members and individuals around the world. So, for instance, is there more that we should be doing? Some organizations like the Chartered Society have picketed outside of 10 Downey Lane. And that's fine. They have solidarity to do what they feel they should be doing at the country level, and they have. And other organizations or other parts of organizations have also made their demonstrations. But we feel at World Physiotherapy that we need to have a measured approach. And so those possibly listening to this podcast will find that difficult and want to challenge. And I'd invite all of them and anyone to just email me. My email is open, president@world.physio. And let's start the conversation.
So I recognize it's a tough job as a worldwide organization, and the goal being supporting all of the member organizations and not necessarily, I guess, taking stance. And recognizing World Physiotherapy as an association with so many different countries, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in that context?
Yeah. Well, by definition or by membership, I feel and find that we are among the most diverse organizations, physiotherapy related, in the world. I mean, if you look at our board of directors, we have, from a geopolitical level, we have 7 members on the board, all from different parts of the world. And I think we have a distribution in terms of men and women, a fair one. And I think our work, similar to the World Health Organization, but focuses in a lot on those who have less privilege or who are struggling with the physiotherapy profession in terms of getting a foothold into their health systems or their education system or social systems. There's something very courageous also, though, however, that happened at IFOMT, again, the specialty group. They had an election for their new board. And the board, again, democracy is such that people put their names if they want to run, and this is how it goes. And people vote in different ways. And so what happened is with the IFOM previous board, which had 4 or 5 people there, I think there was 3 women and 2 men, or maybe it was the opposite, but it was sort of, and the newly elected board was basically an election of 5 white men. And so on the one side, a person could say, well, that's how it goes, or that's democracy, or you could say, well, that's how the constituents voted. And, that's one approach. The other approach is to say, well, okay, maybe we could do better. There are different ways that this could happen, given that IFOMT is an international global association. It represents 21 different countries all over the world. I was very proud of the new president and the new board saying that this is not what we want, this kind of outcome, and that we need to re-examine the election process. We need to re-examine how candidates are brought forward, how that happens, in order to ensure that you have diversity on their board. So I think when they saw, and by the way, I personally, or World Physiotherapy, takes no credit for any of that, good or bad, because we were a separate organization. But I was very encouraged to see their willingness to go there. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that into the future. We're going to see a lot more people or organizations inside of World Physio and to the periphery, who will ensure that there are processes in place such that a diverse platform of candidates can be brought forward and that outcomes can be different. In other places where I've been, the discussion on equity and diversity, for instance, in parts of Africa, it's a very different conversation, I have found, than what we have in North America. Not better or worse, it's just rather different. And I think there's a unique feature also in Canada, with subsequent to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, that have, I think, from what I understand, not fully been fulfilled, or maybe not even partially fulfilled. So there's a lot more work to do, Tiffany. But I also feel like there are good things that have happened, and I think we have to celebrate even the little steps to see where we need to go to next.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to me because I come from Hong Kong, and obviously the conversation about inclusion is very different because of the difference in society, culture, the makeup of the population, etc. So it's very interesting to think about these differences.
Again, this is just my own personal opinions, but equity, how I interpret it. So in most of my career as an aid worker, it has been focused on people with disabilities, that community-based rehabilitation, war victims rehabilitation. It was always had a focus on disability. And so that was my first exposure to equity issues, really. Also, one of my brothers is a person with a disability. But so that's my view. So I bring to it an equity perspective from a disability rights viewpoint. And, I think we all have plenty to learn and to think about in terms of the greater diaspora of diversity and how we ensure a level of equity that we would all be proud of, because I'm not sure we would all be proud of where we find ourselves today. What do you think?
There was a quote that I heard from one of your lectures. You were quoting Andrew
Guccione. Yeah, Andrew Guccione.
from the 2010 Mary McLennan lecture. Physiotherapy mediates the injustices that have occurred to people that are no fault of their own, which I find that a quote to be very true, and that has been the bedrock of a lot of your humanitarian work.
It certainly has. And Andrew is a good friend of mine. We spoke at the same conference in Rome just before Christmas. And he didn't mean it in the context of humanitarianism, but that's how I took it. And I certainly have been inspired by what he said, because I think that is another part of the gale force winds behind this, is that injustices happen, will continue to happen, and we as a profession can mediate. Obviously, I believe that from a functional, injury perspective in the theater. But I think we can also mediate the injustices from a racial divide in countries. I'll give you an example. So in the southern United States, there's a lot of vitriol. After the killing of George Floyd, myself and two people from Duke and two people from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we wrote a paper called Reckoning with Racial Injustice. It's published in ACRM. But what we did is we looked at, for instance, the racial distribution of health professionals using US Census data. And different groups within the US Census categories, which is the only data we had access to, really show a very large difference of who is in health professions. So, for instance, African American populations are very overrepresented in social workers, but underrepresented, for instance, in physicians. So if we, and I'm not sure the goal needs to be exact number in a population, in a profession, and I'll fully admit this is not my area of scholarship, but it's pretty clear that we could do better and we should be doing better. And that it is important when a patient or a community is seeking reduction in that injustice that we just talked about, that they have access to therapists and communities who they feel connected to. I think that's really important. In fact, when I was a postdoc at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, I attended a lecture one time and completely blown away by it. It was in health behaviors, and it was around diabetes and primary prevention, basically. And so what this one brilliant researcher did is she figured that rather than trying to get to the population themselves, and in North Carolina, there's a highway that bisects the state, and most of the health indicators on the east side are very poor, and on the west, not so bad. And there's also more African American populations on the east than elsewhere. So her target was the east among African American populations presenting with diabetes. So her focus was not directly to get to that population, but to train hairdressers. So her whole study was around health information that would be distributed and disseminated among peers in a community. So the hairdressers were peers of many of the populations who were at the beauty salon. Amazing how effective this was, right? So the population felt more accepted, felt there was no white coats. There was a whole different viewpoint here. And so they made a change. They adjusted those injustices for whatever length of time among however small a group of people. So it is important for populations to be able to seek care among health providers who they feel most comfortable with. And I don't think any one of us should ever have any problems with that. I certainly don't. And in fact, when I go, in the few occasions where I'm involved in a response or humanitarian action, I make sure I'm as far back as humanly possible, because I know the presence of a foreigner can disrupt the whole interactive system in place. And in fact, for the listeners, this book dates back a little now, but it's by one of the most brilliant development economists, in my mind anyway. Her name is Dambisi Moyo. The book is called Dead Aid. Dead Aid. You can get it on every channel. It's actually interesting to listen to. It's not that long of a read either. Anyway, where she argues that part of the problem in Africa has been donations and the fact that it wasn't really an engaged process of recovery and development. It was just sort of throwing money at what most of the West felt was a problem. So, Tiffany, I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling here, so maybe I'll stop. But I feel I need a lot more to do. But at the same time, I go back to my earlier point. We've all got to work hard. And if we work hard, I think we can reduce this. I think racial injustices will likely continue. I think equity is a big challenge. So I think we're doing better, but there's a long road to go.
Absolutely. Coming to the concluding section of the interview, in the next couple of years, I guess you have 3 more years in your presidency?
Yes. Yeah.
What are you hoping to work on in the next 3 years, not limiting to the context of world physiotherapy, but I guess also in your academic research work, professor, etc.?
Well, I'm leaving World Physio aside for the moment. I'm really excited about these 2 new startups that I've founded. We're using AI architecture framing around patient presentation of conditions and signs and symptoms within a profile to figure out the best approach, the most effective approach for individuals. So think personalized rehabilitation. So I'm really excited about that. We've got partners in place. And the same thing happens within my education company as well, where we're focusing on low and middle income countries. So I'm really excited. I think entrepreneurialism will make a change in the world, has made a change in the world. Another controversial point I said in Vancouver was that I think capitalism, done right, actually is a stimulus for good in the world. And I just mentioned Dead Aid with Dambisi Moyo. That's part of her thesis as well. Even in the last couple of days, the president of the Canadian Medical Association has now said it's time to rethink private healthcare as a contributing factor to solving the Canadian healthcare system problems. So I believe that markets work. They don't always work well, but they work in the way they should. And so I think I'm excited about moving in that direction. On a research front, I'll be continuing to explore AI and its derivatives in healthcare and decision making. And with World Physio, I think there's a couple things. One of them is to increase our footprint. I think not for increasing it just for that sake, but to become a larger, more powerful voice for physiotherapists around the world. And I think our value statements need to bring in a lot of other countries who will start to contribute, and we would contribute to them. China being a big one, a lot of politics, obviously, around that, but we're working through it. So some of these are not going to be easy. I never thought being president would be easy. Don't worry. Never thought it was a walk in the park, but I look forward to solving and to working with our teams to solve some of these really important problems that we have in our profession and being better for it.
Amazing. Look forward to what you do in your startups and see you again in 2025 World Physio Congress in Tokyo. Any concluding thoughts before we hit the end recording button?
Nothing really, Tiffany, other than to say just thank you and the pain division, Paincast, for creating this opportunity to not just talk about pain, but going a little bit broader. And thanks to you. I mean, you're part of the solution of the future, your generation. And it's been wonderful to get to know you. And you did a great job here.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to part 2 of Fireside Chat with Mike. You might want to listen to part 1 if you haven't already, where we talk about personal responsibility and societal changes to envision in the physiotherapy profession. Paincast is a freely available resource to help you learn more about pain and physiotherapy. We would really appreciate it if you can support our podcast by subscribing it and rating it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and share it with your network. You can also use the feedback form linked in the show notes to help us improve. Thank you again, and stay tuned for future episodes on pain and physiotherapy.